He had been married 3 times. 3 times, with the full, exhausting inventory of difficulties that implies. The jealousies, the mismatched ambitions, the colliding egos, and the profound structural misunderstandings of what a life shared with a genius actually required. He was 40 years old. In the jazz world of the early 1942, a man who had been blowing the trumpet as hard and as high as he had since he was a teenager was already a veteran who carried the weight of a much older man. He was one of the most famous musicians in the world, a pioneer who had quite literally rewritten the rhythmic and melodic vocabulary of American music. And yet, he was alone in the specific, hollow way that very busy, very surrounded people can be alone. The loneliness of the icon is a crowded room. It is a dressing room packed with sycophants, managers, promoters, and hangers-on, all of whom want a piece of the golden aura. It is the isolation of being the meal ticket for an entire entourage. Then, one evening, he walked into the Cotton Club in Harlem, which he had done many times before. The air was thick with smoke and the frantic energy of wartime New York. The band was swinging, the brass was roaring, and there, amidst the precise, synchronized glamour of the chorus line, he saw Lucille Wilson dancing. He stayed after the show to talk to her. He was not a man who required a lot of time to understand what was in front of him. He had spent 40 years listening to the subtle microtones of a blues progression, to the acoustic resonance of dance halls across 2 continents, to the unspoken motives of the people who smiled at him. His ear for truth was absolute. He knew very quickly, within the span of a single conversation in the wings of that legendary club, that Lucille Wilson was fundamentally different from everyone he had been with before. What made her different is hard to reduce to a simple inventory. These things resist lists. Love, particularly the enduring kind, is rarely a matter of checked boxes. But the people who knew them both, the musicians and friends who watched the relationship unfold and deepen across the 29 years it lasted, kept returning to the exact same quality. She was not impressed by Louis Armstrong, the famous person. She was deeply, entirely interested in Louis Armstrong, the man. This sounds simple. It was not simple. It was, in fact, the rarest commodity in his universe. Armstrong had been surrounded by people who were impressed by him since his mid-20s, since the Hot 5 and Hot 7 recordings had turned him into a living legend. The fame had accumulated early, it had compounded, and it had remained. With that fame came the specific, crushing dynamic of constant performance. This was not just a performance on stage. The sweat, the high Cs, the brilliant phrasing, the dazzling entertainer's smile. It was the performance off it, the relentless performance of being Louis Armstrong for people who desperately needed him to be Louis Armstrong. Fans, reporters, politicians, and even friends wanted the caricature of joy. They wanted the gravelly laugh and the boundless warmth. It was exhausting in ways that he rarely articulated, primarily because articulating exhaustion was simply not in his public repertoire. To admit fatigue was to break the spell. Lucille Wilson understood performance because she lived it. She was a dancer at the Cotton Club. She had been there for years, surviving the grueling rehearsals and the demanding schedules. She was a consummate professional, deeply embedded in the intricate competitive fabric of the Harlem entertainment world. She had seen famous musicians before. They were her co-workers, her bosses, the background noise of her daily life. Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway, Count Basie, these were not mythical figures to her, but men who went to work just like she did. She was not, when she finally sat down to speak with Armstrong, someone who needed to be in the presence of his fame to validate her own existence. She was interested in what he was like to talk to, what he thought about the world when the reporters weren't listening, what he was like when the stage lights powered down, when the trumpet was securely locked in its case, and when the relentless performance was finally turned off. He found this disorienting in the best possible way. It was a kind of psychological oxygen he had not breathed before. His previous marriages had all been, in different, complicated ways, entanglements with the world of his career. They were women who were part of the musical world, who had defined roles in relation to his fame, who related to him largely through what he was professionally. Daisy Parker, his first wife, a fiery relationship from his youth in New Orleans, steeped in the volatile energy of a boy just discovering his power. Lil Hardin, the brilliantly educated, fiercely ambitious pianist who recognized his raw genius before anyone else and aggressively managed him into stardom, but who often viewed him as a project to be polished rather than a partner to rest with. Alpha Smith, a marriage troubled by mismatched priorities and the chaotic turbulence of a life lived entirely out of suitcases. Subsequent marriages had their own deeply rooted complications, largely stemming from the fact that they could not separate the man from the music. None of them had given him the specific, radical thing Lucille gave him, a quiet, unadorned space in which he was not required to be the center of the universe, a space where he was not primarily performing. They married in 1942. He was 41, she was 23. The age difference was widely noted by the press, by the gossips, by the people who instinctively note these things and weaponize them, which people always do. There were whispers that it wouldn't last, that a hardened, middle-aged road warrior could not possibly build a stable life with a young dancer nearly 2 decades his junior. It was not the central fact of the relationship. The central fact was that they stayed together until he took his final breath 29 years later. The central fact is that the historical accounts of their marriage from the people who observed them up close, the musicians who rode the buses with him, the domestic staff, their lifelong neighbors in Corona, Queens, consistently describe something beautifully functional, incredibly warm, and fiercely reciprocal. She ran the house. She did not do this as a subordinate function, nor as a typical mid-century housewife fading into the background. She did it as someone who actively transformed a piece of real estate into a fortress with real competence and fierce intention. The house in Corona, Queens, a modest working-class neighborhood, which they bought in 1943, was Lucille's project in the deepest sense. While Louis was on tour, Lucille found the property. She chose it. She put down the payment. When Louis returned from the road, he took a cab to an address he had never seen, walked through the front door, and found that his wife had created a sanctuary. She decorated it with an eye for comfort and vibrant modernism. She made it the specific, secure domestic world that Armstrong came home to after decades of impersonal hotel rooms, segregated boarding houses, and grueling tours. The kitchen. It was famously hers, eventually outfitted with custom bright blue cabinetry and state-of-the-art appliances. A hub of warmth where Louis could sit at the table in his undershirt and eat red beans and rice without an audience. The garden. It was her retreat, meticulously landscaped, a patch of quiet green in the middle of the sprawling concrete of New York City. The Den. She built him a customized wood-paneled room specifically for his reel-to-reel tape recorders, understanding his obsessive need to archive audio, to make collages, to listen to his own life. The specific, ordinary, beautiful texture of the life they built together was shaped entirely by her hands. Armstrong traveled constantly. That was an unchangeable law of their reality. He played upwards of 300 shows a year. That was not going to change. It was the core of who he was. It was how he breathed, and it was what his massive global career required. Lucille understood this going in. She was not naive about the reality of loving a traveling musician. She did not travel with him to every single engagement, though she joined him often, particularly on the grueling international tours where he served as America's cultural ambassador. But primarily, she maintained the house. She maintained the home. She became the fixed point on the map that the chaotic touring life required to keep from spinning off its axis. She was the person he called from lonely hotel rooms across 5 continents, from Tokyo to Paris, from London to Accra. She was the person he wrote long, deeply affectionate letters to, signing them "Red Beans" and "Ricely Yours." She was the person whose opinion he desperately wanted about the things that actually mattered, outside of the chord changes and the box office receipts. In the early years, the marriage had its difficulties. It would be entirely dishonest to paint it as a frictionless fairy tale. A 40-year-old man with a fiercely complicated romantic history and deeply ingrained bachelor habits, and a 23-year-old woman attempting to navigate the immense gravity of a globally famous spouse would predictably face turbulent waters. There were massive tensions. There were profound adjustments. Armstrong was not a simple person to live with. He was undeniably warm, he was legendary for his generosity, and he was razor-sharp funny. But he was also a man who had spent his entire adult life in a world that meticulously organized itself around his needs, his schedule, and his talent. Decades of that treatment creates rigid psychological habits that are not easily unlearned. He was used to his word being final. He was used to the world bending to his trumpet. Lucille possessed a rare, unshakable clarity about herself that made the adjustment not just possible, but successful. She was not trying to reshape Louis Armstrong into someone different. She had no desire to fix him. Conversely, she was entirely uninterested in the exhausting drama of managing a famous man. She was interested only in the actual person sitting across the kitchen table from her. She was invested in the life they could build together in Queens, in what was tangible and real, rather than what was performed for the cameras. She gave him the immense, quiet room to be exactly what he was, flaws and all. And she asked for only one thing in return, that he see her as clearly and as honestly as she saw him. He did. It took effort, and it took time, but over the years he truly did. The marriage found its unique shape. It settled into a profound rhythm, and it kept that rhythm for 29 years. They became a united front against a world that constantly wanted to consume him. The twilight years. The people who watched Armstrong closely in his final decade, through the 1,960 seconds and into the early 1970s, described a man who was, in some very specific and noticeable ways, more at peace than he had ever been in his earlier, more turbulent decades. This was not resignation. Peace and resignation are entirely different emotional landscapes. He was not giving up. He was still playing, still recording massive hits like Hello Dolly and What a Wonderful World, still performing on television, still fully and vibrantly present in the work that defined him. But beneath the public joy, there was a new quality of profound settledness in his personal life that had absolutely not always been there. The restless anxiety of his youth had burned off. The house in Corona was the undisputed center of this newfound gravity, and Lucille was the undisputed center of the house. She had built him a world where he was safe, where he was loved not for what he could play, but for who he was. He died in his sleep on July 6, 1971, at the house in Queens. His heart, which had given out so much to so many for so long, simply stopped. Lucille was there. She had been there across all the years of the marriage. She had been there in the vibrant days at the house in Queens, hosting neighborhood kids on the stoop. She had been there during the terrifying trips to the intensive care units during his bad stretches of heart failure in the late 60s. And she was there at the very end, when the golden trumpet was finally silenced, and his raspy, beautiful voice was all that was left to echo in the halls. She outlived him by 16 years. She did not fade into obscurity. Instead, she spent the vast majority of that time working tirelessly to preserve exactly what he had been, what their house was, and what the massive, meticulously curated archive he had left behind could tell future generations who wanted to truly understand who Louis Armstrong was. The Louis Armstrong House Museum, a National Historic Landmark that stands today in Queens, exists solely because of the foresight and dedication of Lucille Armstrong. The archive, the thousands of hours of reel-to-reel tapes he recorded of their daily conversations, the hundreds of letters, the scrapbooks, the candid photographs, the custom-made trumpets, the objects of a life fully lived, is accessible to scholars and fans today because she fiercely protected it. She fought off developers, she navigated the complex legalities of his estate, and ultimately, she entrusted it to Queens College to ensure it would be preserved in perpetuity. The incredible record of who he was privately, underneath the heavy mask of the performance, is available to history because the young woman he married in 1942 understood a fundamental truth. The private, quiet Armstrong, the man who loved his wife, who loved his neighborhood, who just wanted to eat his dinner in peace, was a man worth preserving just as carefully as the public icon the world worshipped. He stayed after the show at the Cotton Club to talk to her. He had done many things in his life with raw instinct, with street-smart intelligence, and with the kind of hyper-aware reading of a room that a black man in America had to develop across 40 years to survive and conquer the globe. That conversation amidst the fading lights and the lingering cigarette smoke of Harlem was one of them. It was perhaps the most crucial instinctual decision of his life. He talked to her for exactly 5 minutes. He listened to the cadence of her voice. He looked into her eyes, and he saw a mirror that didn't distort his reflection. He knew. Right then, he knew. 29 years later, as he closed his eyes for the last time in the bed they shared, he was still right.